Now, the standard that they're going to use is ISO 20022 XML, which is a bit of a mouthful. I mean, what sort of challenges does that give to corporates, and I mean, how can a bank like HSBC help them solve that problem?
Sure. Yes, I mean, one of the favoured formats in any banking payment systems around the world these days in connectivity between bank and corporate is XML. It's one of the newer standards. You know, we've had a lot of legacy standards in the past for connectivity. The interbank piece in SEPA has always been in XML, and now we're extending this out so that actually the corporate to bank communication is in XML format. And it's a much more flexible format. The format gives much more in the way of field length. So, for example, in remittance data, you know, some of the legacy systems, you had really short amounts of data you could carry with your payment message. Now you've got 140 characters within the SEPA message. So not only is it much more standard and uniform, and that's important because, you know, the Belgian clearing format was different from the French, was different from the Irish, was different from the Italian. And part of this is the harmonisation of those formats into one uniform standard.
All right, so it's one of these things where it's going to be better when we get there, but it's probably going to be a little bit challenging in the interim.
Yeah.
So I mean, give us a little bit of a sort of roadmap of what are sort of the key things that companies have got to get to terms with.
Sure. I mean, there's several things. I mean, firstly, it is the IT side of this, because the systems that are creating these payments are generally ERP systems, and some of them will have their own formatting. Now that needs to be changed, so there's got to be an XML generator somewhere within there that will now generate these new messages, if that's possible within the ERP. There's also things like data and the quality of the data that you have. So, for example, if you're using legacy clearing systems, you're using kind of routing codes, sort codes that are the domestic codes. They're called B-bands. Well, actually, SEPA will work on BIC and IBAN, eventually just going to IBAN itself. You can actually drop the BIC eventually, but for the moment, they've got to collect BIC and IBAN data. So part of the issue for customers is actually getting data and making sure your customers know your BIC and IBAN. So putting it on invoices, collecting it from other invoices that you get in, and then actually making sure that you can get that in your ERP, rather than the legacy B bands and account numbers. So there's some IT work to be done around that. There's some data collection points to be done around that.
All right, so there's quite a lot of work.
Yes, there is.
But we need to see some upside from this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what could it do for a company's treasury function when they've put all this in place? I mean, we want to see in a way beyond just complying with the regulation, but, you know, I mean, it's good for companies to feel that there's a sort of business motivation for it.
And there absolutely is for this, because you know, the whole idea behind SEPA is to put a much more level playing field in the payment space in Europe, to ensure that, you know, pricing is much more uniform. You know, we used to have different pricing. The PSD a few years ago sorted out the difference between international and domestic pricing, so that it's now all got to be the same across the Eurozone. It will allow great opportunities for centralisation, because SEPA, you can pay from any one bank account location to all of the other Eurozone countries and all that are involved in the Euro. So you don't have to have all these different bank accounts now around the Eurozone, which you had typically before, and that leads to centralisation, that leads to better management of liquidity. So there are some tremendous upsides as you re-engineer your treasury around this particular upgrade.
All right, now that's all very well for companies doing business within Europe, but what about if you're a company that wants to do business outside Europe, or equally you're a company outside Europe, which a lot of HSBC customers are, you know, doing business into Europe?
Yep. I mean, the same will apply. I mean, one of the things that we're spending some time doing is now educating our clients who are out of the region, who are much less familiar with what goes on in the region, perhaps that have got subsidiaries in Europe, but they of course have to be compliant too. Their ERP systems might be in America or Asia or the Middle East, and the same process has to be gone through. So the same generation of the XML messages, the same decisions as to where the bank accounts are going to be. So it's an education exercise, but also those projects have got to be done just as much outside of Europe as they have got to be done inside of Europe.
Right, so this is a challenge for companies everywhere then.
So if this is a company in, you know, Japan or Korea or Canada or the United States, and they generate the payments because they perhaps operate a shared service center or a payment factory or an in-house bank, then all of these have still got to be regulatory compliant. They've still got to come in, because wherever the bank account is in the Eurozone, that's what dictates the legislation that actually they have to abide to for the payment. So it's just a bigger issue if you're outside of the Eurozone than it is if you're in.
All right, now we've talked a bit about the opportunities now, but what about the downside? So let's say that I'm a company and I just say, oh, this is a hassle, I'm going to ignore it. I mean, what are the risks for me if I do that?
Sure. Well, firstly, I don't think you can just ignore it, because this is a legislative area. So, these rules and regulations have gone into statute, they will be on the books. So if you wish to make payments in the Eurozone, in the low value clearing, in the SEPA clearing, you have to do it this way. There are no alternatives. And one of the things that perhaps is the biggest problem is getting the XML piece ready. That is a big amount of work. So a lot of the banks, us included, are looking at how we can help our customers in being able to take their legacy files, their legacy formats, and actually help them turn that into XML format so that they can be ready and compliant, for the timescales of the 1st of February 14. And I think customers, when they look at the amount of work that they probably have to do in the ERP space, I think that will be their biggest challenge, because, as we know, these ERP systems are quite complex. Sometimes just getting the budgets to change them and the lead times for doing that actually can be quite long. So actually, to be truthful, they should have already started. I mean, we're now getting almost a little bit late for it, but there's still time. But they do have to have a very firm project plan, and it has to be carried through with the right kind of impetus from Treasury, because this is where it's got to be driven from.
I've been talking to Robin Terry. He's the head of business development and sales at HSBC's payments and cash management business in Europe. And we've been discussing how companies now need to comply with SEPA. There's a firm deadline and the opportunities that you can make in terms of re-engineering your corporate treasury function in doing just that.